CISA, the IS Audit Process, Part 1. You know, if I had my way, we would just kind of jump into my lab environment. We would get on our server, start looking at Windows 2003 and the security auditing features. We would jump into the Cisco Security Access Control Server for Windows and start looking at the different reporting capabilities, the authentication, authorization, and accounting mechanisms. We'd start looking at our syslog server and breaking down those logs and auditing different events. But you know what? We can't do that yet because we have to learn to walk before we can run. And as part of this process to achieving the Certified Information Systems Auditor certification, we want to make sure that we understand the basic functionality, the basic terminology, the basic processes. So in these first couple of real nuggets here, we're going to look at the IS audit process, and we're going to break down what you need to know from an exam standpoint, but also start giving you the tools that you need to become a successful systems auditor. Well, here it is over here on the upper left-hand corner, that Certified Information Systems Auditor Certificate. That's the goal, and we're just now starting on this journey to achieve that goal. And in part 1 of the IS audit process, we're going to cover 4 key objectives. First of all, we need to define what auditing is. What is an audit and what is an auditor? Okay, what do they do? Then we'll look at the audit planning process. We'll break this down into 8 steps. Then we'll start looking at the 2 of our first main concepts of the IS auditing process. The initial concept of risk analysis, and then what risk analysis leads to, which is the implementation of internal controls. Now, throughout the remainder of this nugget, what you're going to see is the handwriting on the wall, or my handwriting on this screen here. But what we're going to do right now is I want to give you just some basic definitions that I've printed out here that are really important for us to establish right off the bat. First of all, you know, what is an audit anyway? This whole thing about auditing and auditors, we want to kind of define these terms, as we say here in Texas, from the get-go. So an audit is an evaluation, okay? It's an evaluation, and it's an evaluation process. You're looking at an organization, or you're evaluating a particular system, in our case maybe a security system or a change configuration system. It could be an audit of an actual process, the process that's a software process or a process that involves people. Or you audit or evaluate projects or products. Now, what is an auditor? An auditor is a competent, independent, and objective person. And this is very important because the auditor typically is a third-party individual. But for many of us, we'll actually be hired by the company that we're auditing for. And that automatically creates a kind of a conflict of interest. But we are being paid and we are being called upon to be independent and as objective as possible. Once we come up with our results, we then issue a report to decision makers. Now, we're looking at IT auditing, specifically information technology or information system auditing. And this is defined as an examination of the controls within an entity, which could be an organization, a company, a customer, a client, within an entity's information technology infrastructure. Now, this used to be called an EDP audit, or an electronic data processing audit. But the IT audit is collecting and evaluating evidence of an organization's information system, of their operations and their practices, their policies and their procedures. We gather this evidence to evaluate if the organization's information systems are properly safeguarding or protecting their assets, are they maintaining data integrity, and are they operating efficiently and effectively to reach the organization's either their business goals or their nonprofit goals. Now, that is the basic idea of what an auditor does. But there's 2 types of auditors. You've got internal auditors who are employees of the company that are hired to actually assess and evaluate these IT systems or information systems. They're going to present their reports and their results directly to the board of directors or the top management, and they're expected to maintain their independence and their objectivity as part of their job goal, as part of their job description. The second type of auditor is the external auditor. The external auditors are third-party independent staff individuals that are basically hired by an auditing firm or assigned by the firm to go in and evaluate things like financial statements, information systems, network infrastructure, security policy, basically performing agreed upon evaluations between the auditing firm and the individual organization, the customer or the company. So these are four main definitions you want to have from the very beginning. What auditing is, what an auditor is, and the fact that there's two types of auditors, internal and external. Well, you've heard the old saying, if you fail to plan, then plan to fail. And throughout this CISA Nugget series, we're going to look at several different processes that apply to different technologies, different components that an auditor will audit. And of course, one of the main things you must do at the outset is to plan. It's like Abraham Lincoln said, before he's going to chop down a tree, he's going to spend 90% of his time sharpening the axe. Now, planning involves short-term planning and long-term planning, and you want to be doing this auditing process on at least an annual basis, once a year. So we're going to be looking at our short-term goals for our organization and then long-term planning. This could be a 5-year plan. Many governments, many societies and their state infrastructures will have a 5-year plan. We can do a short-term plan, which could be based on different quarters or based on a year, based on a certain amount of months. Long-term planning, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Of course, it all depends upon the business goals and the business needs. When we do this planning on at least an annual basis, what are the things we're going to take into consideration? We're going to look at new control issues. Are there any new hardware or software solutions that have been introduced into our organization where we have to think about new types of controls? For example, have you recently upgraded from a Windows 2000 to Windows 2003 environment? Have you gone from, let's say, a Windows environment to a Linux environment where you've got new types of controls? Perhaps you've added some new hardware security devices, firewall systems, intrusion prevention systems. Maybe you're changing your whole access control strategy from usernames and passwords to some type of token-based security or biometric security. All these considerations are part of the planning process. Now, I just alluded to the second aspect, changing or upgrading technology, but the first bullet point was really talking about control issues and control mechanisms. But this is overall changes to technology, okay? We want to plan for not only short-term changes or upgrades to our technology, but long-term upgrades or changes to our technology. For example, maybe we're upgrading to an IEEE 802.1x authentication mechanism, which involves authenticating and authorizing users and end systems. Next, we want to plan our auditing around the business processes, the business procedures, the needs of our business, and the goals of our business. For example, the auditing process will be totally different if we're a retailer or a manufacturer with a large amount of inventory on hand, as opposed to, let's say, a internet-based service industry that functions as a broker or a middleman. And then, of course, a big part of short and long-term planning is isolating what your auditing or your evaluation techniques are going to be. And the good news is, throughout this CISA Nugget series, we'll investigate and explore and learn about a variety of evaluation techniques that you can apply to different scenarios. And there are other considerations too. The IS auditor needs to know about major concepts like the management's approach to risk assessment, regulatory requirements and privacy issues, for example, HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. Also consider any deadlines for implementation or upgrade to software and hardware. You'll also want to know what are the limitations of your IS resources. All of these things are going to affect the overall approach of the audit and the auditor. And obviously, planning for an audit means using a proven step-by-step process all along the way. And before you begin the actual auditing process, understand thoroughly what that step-by-step process is and what it entails. Remember, the ISACA has IS auditing standards, and it really demands that the auditor plan well for the work to make sure that you're meeting the goals and the auditing objectives, that you're complying with applicable professional auditing standards and procedures. So to perform audit planning, the IS auditor should do these steps in the following order. First of all, you need to gather data or gather information. You need to get a general understanding of the mission of the business, the business's or the organization's objectives, its purpose, and its procedures. This includes information about availability, integrity, security, and business technology. Secondly, you want to identify the stated components. These are typically in the written security policy or written policies and procedures. These are components like policies, standards, required guidelines, procedures, and the organization's structure. The third step is to perform a risk assessment, looking at any privacy impact analysis. This should be led by the management or decision makers. Then, plan to perform risk analysis. We'll talk more about risk assessment and risk analysis later on in this CISA series. The fifth step is to plan for conducting an internal control review, then setting your audit scope and objectives. For example, are you just auditing the financial aspect of the organization? Are you just auditing the security policy of the organization? The seventh step in the planning process is to develop an auditing strategy or an auditing approach. Fortunately, you don't have to develop this auditing strategy in a vacuum. In this CISA series, I'll give you all the tools you need to develop this strategy. And then finally, once you've accomplished all 7 steps, you're now ready to assign the resources. This is actually personnel resources to complete the process. Let's talk more about this gather information or gather data. The IS auditor needs to gain a full understanding of the business. This is going to mean touring the key organization facilities, looking at the physical infrastructure, reading up on background materials, publications from the industry, annual reports, semi-annual reports, perhaps independent financial analysis reports. You also want to look at the short-term and long-term strategic plans. You'll want to interview key personnel, key decision makers, the CIO, key managers. You want to understand the business issues and the business needs. And obviously, you'll want to review any prior auditing reports that were done by third-party experts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you may be under the realm of HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. So you want to identify specific regulations, federal regs and state regs that are applicable to information technology and information systems in that organization. Now realize I've mentioned things like Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA, and it's important to understand the effects of laws and regulations on audit planning. But realize that the CISA candidate won't be asked about any specific laws or regulations. You might be questioned about how you would audit for compliance to laws and regulations, as I've alluded to, but you're only going to be expected to know about accepted global practices, not specifics of, let's say, HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. The first major concept we want to cover in this IS auditing process nugget movie is the concept of risk analysis. And we've already mentioned risk assessment, and we'll get to that in a second, but realize that risk assessment is really just one of the steps of the overall risk analysis process. Risk analysis is a major aspect of auditing, and right along with risk analysis is the complementary controls or mitigation techniques that we put in place to address the risk in our organization, and we'll cover that here as well in just a second. But before we do this, let's just get some basic definitions here. Risk analysis. Here's a kind of a classic risk analysis definition. Risk analysis is a technique for identifying and assessing factors that can jeopardize a process or a goal. In our case, the process is the information technology process, the information systems process. The goals are the business goals, the business needs of the organization. Risk analysis involves implementing preventative measures, which means mitigation, countermeasures, and controls to avert the negative impact of incidents. The bottom line is this: unless you're going to plan to put into place mitigation techniques and countermeasures and controls to address this risk, then basically the analysis is for nothing. It's for naught, because obviously risk and risk mitigation go hand in hand. Now let's define what risk is. Here's a classic definition from the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. It is: risk is the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or a group of assets to cause loss or damage to the assets. Now, from an IT or an information systems standpoint, we kind of break this down into threats and vulnerabilities of processes, IT and IS processes, and physical and information assets. Physical assets, that's obviously equipment, the physical location, the building, the contents of the building. Information assets really goes to intellectual property and data. Then, of course, from an ITIS standpoint, we look at impact, the impact on assets based on the threats and vulnerabilities. And part of that impact is going to be assigning some dollar value to the impact. Now, why are we going to have some quantitative analysis? Why are we going to apply some dollar value? Because if the countermeasure or the control or mitigation that we put in place costs much more than the actual value of the asset, whether it be physical or intellectual, then that's going to have a negative impact on our business. Okay, so we have to kind of analyze how much these assets are worth, bottom line, and then put in countermeasures and mitigation techniques that are going to justify the expense. And then probability. What is the probability or the likelihood or the frequency of occurrence of the threat or vulnerability? If it's rare, then we may not want to spend the money to mitigate or put in a countermeasure. We also want to realize that from an auditing standpoint, we're typically going to look at risk analysis and focus on the most costly areas, the most mission critical areas, the ones that are going to have the biggest impact on our business, on our bottom line, and we're going to attack those first. And that's just good common sense. As I've mentioned, the logical end result for risk analysis is a countermeasure, a mitigation, or implementing controls to counteract the risk, the vulnerability, the threat. So we assess the countermeasures to see, first of all, through a cost-benefit analysis, we find out if the cost of the countermeasure is actually worth it. Is it compared to the benefits that we gain from mitigating against the threat? Then we want to assess management's tolerance for risk. Some organizations have a higher tolerance. In other words, the people at the top, they're gamblers, okay? They're more willing to roll the dice if they're not going to get a devastating denial of service attack against their network perimeter. They're more willing to risk corporate espionage or terrorism attacks, or maybe they're more willing to risk a natural disaster because they don't necessarily live in an area that's prone to hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, things like that. So you need to determine when assessing which countermeasures you're going to put in place, what is the management's tolerance? How far are they willing to roll the dice? Then you'll need to come down on the side of some preferred ways to reduce the risk or mitigate against the risk. You may decide, you know what, we're going to end the risk altogether. We're going to put the most, we'll use for an example, denial of service attacks and other external internet attacks against the perimeter of your network. Maybe we're going to put in the most sophisticated security devices possible to implement intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, and anti-malware techniques. So throwing a bunch of money at hardware and software solutions, hiring programmers that know, let's say, for example, XML, and can put into place day one solutions to attacks, the day or within 48 hours of them happening. Or maybe you just want to minimize the potential for an attack. You can't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, but you have a reasonable budget to go put into place some above average security mechanisms. Using the denial of service attack against a server example, some service providers may want to go ahead and spend their money just increasing their bandwidth by having bigger pipes so that the denial of service attack actually just minimizes the impact. They're not going to actually reduce the potential for attacks. They aren't going to stop the denial of service attack. They're just going to add so much bandwidth availability that it basically overcomes the denial of service attack. Or you may decide as an organization to just transfer the responsibility, to go and buy insurance so that when something does happen, the insurance company can take over. That's what we call responsibility transfer. So you want to conclude, obviously, along with your management's tolerance for risk, how are you going to reduce or mitigate this risk? And then really this is a three-phased approach. Risk assessment, and risk assessment is probably the most important step in this risk management process as we look to assessing our potential countermeasures. We're basically going to identify and assess the steps that are possible. And this is really done with a mathematical process, and it goes back to kind of cost-benefit analysis. And then putting in the risk mitigation techniques, and then reassessing the entire process and starting all over again. The great thing about risk analysis is it provides so many purposes, so it delivers so many solutions for the auditor. First of all, it helps the auditor identify the threats to the organization, and then different areas that need to be controlled. It helps us evaluate what countermeasures, what techniques we're going to use to control the situation, the mitigation processes that are going to be put in place. It helps us decide as an auditor on our objectives, our overall objectives and goals for the auditing process. We know exactly what we're going to do once we go into the process. It supports risk-based auditing decisions. By using a risk-based approach, it removes a lot of the subjectivity and politics involved in knowing which areas to audit, the mission-critical areas to audit, and the subsequent decisions that are made based on the results. It leads to implementation of the best internal controls. That's what we're going to talk about next in this Nugget movie, internal controls. Internal controls are basically the result of our risk analysis. Internal controls are the practices, the mechanisms, the structures, the techniques, whatever verb or adjective I want to use here, that are implemented to reduce risk. They provide a certain level of assurance to management, to decision makers, to the board of directors that our risks of our organization can be identified, they can be prevented, and, if necessary, repaired after the fact. Internal controls address the key business or operational objectives of our organization, as well as the undesired events and mitigation of those events. So two key aspects of internal controls are what we're trying to achieve with those controls for our business and what should we avoid. Now, internal controls are typically categorized or classified in three different main categories: preventative controls, detective controls, and corrective controls. Let's break these down one at a time. The first category is preventative controls, and these are basically put in place to determine an issue or a challenge before it actually arises. With this control, you're going to monitor both the operation and the input into, let's say, a data system or a service system. You're trying to predict potential problems before they occur and make adjustments. The goal of preventative controls is to prevent errors, omissions, or malicious acts from happening. This could be things like only hiring qualified people in your organization, controlling access to the physical facility or the plant, using encryption techniques to prevent unauthorized disclosure of data, access controls that only allow certain authorized personnel to get access to sensitive data, and well-designed documentation to prevent errors. The second category of controls is a detective control. These are basically using mechanisms that detect and report the occurrence of an error, an omission, or a malicious act. This could be something like an intrusion detection system or hashing mechanisms for integrity. This can involve processes like duplicate checking of calculations and periodic performance reporting. This area also involves internal auditing functions, reviewing of activity logs like on a syslog server, and checkpoints in project management or production of software development. The third category is the corrective control. And this is basically what we do to minimize the impact of an incident or a threat that's already occurred. We're trying to fix it after the fact. We're trying to remedy the problem that was discovered typically by some type of detective control. For example, we've got an intrusion detection service that detects a vulnerability. We've already got an issue or a problem on some particular host, and we're going to quarantine that host and remove the malware. Corrective controls identify the causes of problems, correct errors that come from these problems, and, if necessary, we're going to modify the processes, modify the systems to make changes so that we minimize future occurrences of this same problem. Other types of internal controls that are corrective are things like contingency planning, backup procedures, and testing. It's important to realize, though, in a nutshell, that the three main categories of internal controls are preventative, detective, and corrective. There are quite a few goals or objectives of internal controls, and some of these things I'm going to point out here are going to kind of overlap as we look at some of the general procedures or types of controls. But the goals of internal controls, I like the way that rhymes there, is basically to control the accounting operations, to make sure that you're controlling the financial aspect of your organization, to control or manage the daily ongoing business functions. Internal controls controls can help us achieve that as well. To manage administration of systems, administration of data, and policy, implementing security policies and overall usage policies. These are goals of internal controls. To safeguard the assets of our organization, either intellectual assets or physical assets. Making sure that we are complying to corporate or legal mandates. AAA services. One of the major goals of internal controls is to provide authentication, authorization, and accounting for our organization, making sure that the data input and output is accurate. This is involving, let's say I mentioned a while ago, hashing, in other words, using cryptographic methods to do integrity checks on both sides of a transaction to make sure that nothing has changed in process, nothing has changed in transit, the accuracy of input and output of data. Also, reliability, the reliability of systems, the reliability of software, the reliability of our network infrastructure, the reliability of data, reliability, fault tolerant systems, multiple redundant systems, and the ability to back up and restore. These are key aspects of internal controls, or the goals of internal controls. And then finally, to manage any changes to our systems, our processes, our policy, as well as changes to configuration. And this ties in directly to kind of the general overall control, internal control methods or internal control types. Really from a trivial standpoint, from a testing standpoint, it would be good to know these kind of general categories of methods. We've got internal accounting controls, we've got operational controls, we've got administrative controls, organizational security policy controls, documentation controls, the facility or the physical premises controls, and controls over our data center and information technology resources. Now, with all of this terminology and all these different processes and this look at risk analysis and different types of controls, we can now take this information and we can segue into our next nugget movie. But we're actually going to start looking at performing an information systems audit and the different processes that we would go through to perform this audit. In the information systems auditing process part 1, we covered 4 key objectives. First of all, we defined auditing and auditors. We then looked at the audit planning process. We broke down risk analysis and then what it leads to, internal controls. I hope this CBT Nugget has been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in IS Audit Process Part 2.